So we come to the 30th and final installment of our history of Christian missions. And although we've largely been pursuing this series chronologically, I've realized there's one individual that I probably should have included earlier. So I've decided that he should close this series, which is not entirely inappropriate because his life in many ways encapsulates much of the challenge, the struggle, and the commitment that we've witnessed so far in really all the pioneers. His name, Adoniram Judson, missionary to Burma, 1788 to 1850. Now, Adoniram Judson more than qualifies because, first of all, he was the first Protestant missionary from the United States of America. So he led the way in heralding really the dawn of what would be a veritable transatlantic flood a century or so after his death. And although he wasn't the first missionary to serve in Burma, today, by the way, known as Myanmar, he was the one who would establish an ongoing Christian involvement in that nation. So Adoniram Judson, Adoniram, by the way, is a Hebrew Old Testament name, which means my Lord is exalted, was born in Massachusetts, the United States, in 1788 AD. He was the son of a congregational minister. He proved to be a very able student, and while studying at university, became close friends with Jacob Eames. Jacob Eames espoused deism. Now, deism is a doctrine that rejects supernatural revelation and really the teaching of the churches. And it was strongly, in turn, rejected by the conservative congregational church in which Adoniram had been raised. But Judson was becoming dissatisfied with the faith of his father, feeling it was unable to answer his intellectual questions. And so finally, against his parents' wishes, he decided to set out and see the world for himself, heading for New York, where he planned to try and establish himself as a writer. However, before long, he became disenchanted and dissatisfied, feeling his life was going nowhere. One evening, he stopped at an inn, but his sleep was greatly interrupted during the night by the painful groans of a man in the room next to him. The next morning, he inquired from the hotel staff about this unfortunate fellow traveller, only to discover not only that he had died during the night, but it was none other than Jacob Eames. Adoniram Judson was stunned and underwent a period of intense soul searching, and prodigal-like, he decided to make his way back home. Well, it was only a few months later that he made a serious commitment of himself to God. And shortly after this, he read a printed copy of a stirring missionary message, which had been given actually by a British minister. He was so moved by this that he vowed that he would be the first ever American foreign Protestant missionary. Now, while the seminary that he was attending could hardly be described as a hotbed of missionary zeal, he did find some other students with similar convictions, including Samuel Mills, who'd been the leader of the famous Haystack prayer meeting some years earlier. Have you heard of the Haystack prayer meeting? The Haystack prayer meeting was the result of a huge thunderstorm which caused a group who had been praying outside to take shelter under a haystack and continue praying there. And the special focus of that particular day was for the awakening of foreign missionary interest among the students. And while there, under the haystack as it were, they were convicted to pledge themselves to missionary service, which led in turn to them forming a group commonly referred to today as the American Board. Samuel Mills exhorted them with the words, "We can do this if we will." And that little phrase became the watchword for the group. Well, around this time, Judson had commenced an acquaintanceship with Anne Heseltine, always known subsequently as Nancy, who, not unlike Judson, had undergone a powerful conversion, turning from a very rebellious teenager into a serious but committed, lively adult. She was burdened for the unevangelized and frequently declared her intention of going to India. Well, in February 1812, she and Adoniram were married, and 13 days later, they set sail for India, arriving in Calcutta in mid-June. The voyage proved to be something of an unexpected and subsequently controversial turning point. You see, the long journey by sea was not just an extended honeymoon. Adoniram and Nancy spent many hours in Bible study, particularly searching out the true meaning of baptism, something that had been weighing heavily on Judson's mind. Knowing that on arrival he would be meeting the legendary English Baptist William Carey, amongst others, was a grand motivation. And Stephen Neal notes that, quote, Judson set to work to prepare himself by reading up the baptismal question. To his surprise, he found himself led to the conviction that the baptism of believers is the only proper fulfillment of the scriptural ordinance. Well, having set sail from the USA as a respected Congregationalist, he then arrives in India as a convinced Baptist and duly resigns his connection with the American Board. Whereupon, on arrival, William Ward, remember, he was the printer of the Serampore Trio, William Ward baptizes both Adoniram and his wife Nancy. Well, needless to say, as Ruth Tucker explains, when word reached the USA that Judsons, both of them, had moved into the Baptist camp, there was uproar among the Congregationalists. How could their star pioneer missionary desert them after all they had invested in him? Meanwhile, on the other side, the Baptists were elated and quickly moved to form their own missionary society and to underwrite his support. But once in India, they encountered, as William Carey had, huge difficulties because of the opposition of the East India Company. And so, unable to really settle there, they eventually made their way to Burma, which had been originally the country on Adoniram Judson's heart, until he'd heard about the brutal way foreigners were treated there. And as events would later turn out, he had good reason to have such apprehension. The Judsons were not the first, as I said, to bring the gospel to Burma. Others had come and gone, including Felix Carey, who, to the great disappointment of his father William, had accepted a role with the Burmese government, although he did later return to India to work with his father. The voyage to Burma was rough, very rough. The ship was small, smelly, and dirty. And sadly, the constant pitching and tossing of the vessel caused Nancy to go into premature labour, delivering a stillborn child. She was so weak on arrival that there was some concern she would survive, and she had to be bodily, physically carried off the ship. However, once in Rangoon, today that's Yangon, they had the large Baptist mission house to themselves and spent up to 12 hours a day studying the difficult Burmese language. Well, while Nancy quickly became fluent, Adoniram struggled with the written language, which presented itself as a continual sequence of letters with no punctuation, no capital letters, and no divisions between the words, the sentences, or the paragraphs. But it was not just the language that was a barrier between them and the people. Because of entrenched Buddhism, the people had no concept of an eternal God who cared about people. So all their initial attempts to share the gospel were disappointing. Meanwhile, idolatry was rampant, and the people continued to worship what was believed to be a single hair from the head of the Buddha, which was enshrined in an enormous pagoda, which the Burmese visited every 8th day. Shortly after their arrival, other missionaries came, including a printer who was able to start printing the scripture portions that Adoniram had been laboriously translating. The work was tough. And just when it seemed that progress had been made, the tiny seedling was beaten down before it could take root. And this cycle seemed to continue. But from the earliest days, the Judsons were not happy with the location of the mission house because it was somewhat out of the way and rather remote. They really wanted to be able to mingle with the people, to live among them, to reach them on their own level. How could they achieve this? Well, a Zayat proved to be the perfect solution. Zayat, Z-A-Y-A-T. It's found in almost every village, and it serves primarily as a shelter for travellers, also as an assembly for religious occasions. But perhaps most significantly, it's also a location for the villagers to meet and to discuss anything, including the needs and plans of the village. But the lack of finance initially hampered the development of the vision. Finally, after 5 years, Adoniram was able to purchase a piece of property on the Pagoda Road, which was a well-travelled route. There he constructed a building about 20 feet by 20 feet or 6 meters by 6 meters. It was a hut with a wide veranda, and the whole thing was elevated on poles a meter or more from the ground. So they made sure it was built and furnished in regular, traditional Burmese fashion. And the concept worked. Very soon, visitors came, and with that, the first profession of faith made by a Mang Nao at a crowded Sunday service, only a month after the Zayat had opened. 3 weeks later, he was baptized, and later he would write, quote, "I believe that the divine Son, Jesus Christ, suffered death in the place of men to atone for their sins. Moreover, it's only since I've met with you that I've known about the eternal God. By the summer of 1820, there were 10 faithful baptized members who from the beginning took an active role in evangelism. One of the greatest challenges to the work in Burma were the frequent bouts of tropical fever that endangered their lives. They'd already discovered what a threat it was when baby Roger, who was born to them the year after they settled in Rangoon and had filled their hearts with joy, suddenly succumbed to the fever, aged only 6 months old. Nancy also suffered from indifferent health and in 1822 left Adoniram for an extended sick leave that took her to England and then to the United States. 2 years later, in 1824, the political situation in Burma began to look ominous after war broke out between Burma and England, and then all foreigners were suspected of being spies. Adoniram Judson and Dr. Jonathan Price, who was a medical missionary, were arrested and put in a prison cell to await execution, where the conditions were absolutely appalling. Confined with common criminals in a filthy, vermin-infested, damp, dark prison, they had fetters or chains binding their ankles. And then at night they would be hoisted by these fetters on their ankles to a pole until only their head and shoulders were resting on the ground, so they were upside down. There they would remain for hours. And with daily executions, no prisoner knew if he would be the next to be executed. Well, by now, Nancy had returned to Burma, and the suffering her husband endured afflicted her as much, if not more, than it did him. Every day she explained that they were American citizens. They had nothing to do with the British government. But it seemed to make no difference. Sometimes her pleas and her bribes were heeded, but it was generally only temporary relief that Adoniram experienced. To make matters worse, she discovered she was pregnant, but the only bright spots being when she was allowed to visit him after, again, bribing the officials and guards. On February the 15th, 1825, 8 months after his arrest, she arrived carrying their new baby Maria, who was less than 3 weeks old. But the following May, with the advance of the British troops towards the capital, the prisoners were removed and forced to make a death march to another location further north. Now, the prisoners were completely unprepared for the fast-paced movement under the burning sun, and some never lived to make it to the destination. And with Adoniram having spent the best part of a year without any exercise, his blistered feet were soon raw and bleeding. Every step was excruciating torture. At one point on the march, they crossed over a bridge that spanned a dry, rocky riverbed, and for a moment he was tempted to jump over the edge and end it all. While it would have been the easy way out, he rejected the temptation and completed the march only to be confined once again to prison. Nancy only learned of the move some time later, and she had her own problems with both her own personal health challenges as well as that of baby Maria, to the extent that she became too sick to be able to nurse the baby any longer and was really at the mercy of the prison guards to keep the baby alive. The guards permitted Adoniram to leave prison twice a day to take the baby around the village to suckle from nursing mothers. And while the mother and baby began to recover, they would never be restored to full health. After nearly a year and a half in prison, Adoniram was released. During that time of release, the Judsons were able to spend time together and enjoy themselves. Nancy wrote, quote, "No persons on earth were ever happier than we were during the fortnight we passed at the English camp. It was, however, the last time of relaxation they would have together." When, a short time later, Adoniram had to return to Rangoon to help wind up negotiations, he received a letter with a black seal. Nancy, his beloved companion, had died of fever. And a few months later, baby Maria also died. To help drown his sorrows, Judson's reaction was to throw himself into the work. When for more than a year, he kept up a hectic pace with translation and evangelism, but somehow his heart was not in his labours. Underneath the surface, a great pressure of guilt and grief was building up. He couldn't forgive himself for not being with Nancy when she needed him the most. Neither could he handle the overwhelming sorrow that seemed to become more intense. As the depression increased, his output decreased. He began to avoid social contact with others. He began meditating for long periods. He even stopped eating with other missionaries. Finally, 2 years after Nancy's death, he isolated himself completely. He went into the jungle where he built himself a hut and lived as a recluse. He even went so far as to dig a grave where he kept vigil for days on end, filling his mind with morbid thoughts of death, engulfed with a sense of desolation. He wrote, "God is to me the great unknown. I believe in him, but I find him not." I mean, I think to us it's clear what's happening. The combination of imprisonment and death and sickness had lowered his mental resistance in a day when on mission teams there were no psychiatrists or psychoanalysts or group therapy or counselling or people care available. He was left to battle alone. Well, having said that, there was a tremendous outpouring of love and prayer, both by his colleagues and also his native converts. And slowly, he managed to recover from the paralyzing depression and began again traveling in Burma, helping other missionaries. And it's amazing. It was noticeable that everywhere he went, there were huge numbers of inquirers, many converts, and real signs of spiritual growth. He sensed a new spirit of interest. He wrote this, "I sometimes feel alarmed, like a person who sees a mighty engine beginning to move, over which he knows he has no control." However, he was wise enough to realize that there was an even greater job to be done, and that was to finish the Burmese Bible. And that would need more than an occasional hour here and there in the midst of his travels. It meant setting aside 2 years solely to translating between 25 and 30 Old Testament verses each day. That was from the original Hebrew into Burmese, two very complicated language. Well, he met his goal, but of course there would be years ahead of concentrated revision work. And it wasn't until 1840, 14 years after the death of Nancy, that he sent the last page of the Burmese Bible to the printer. However, he had been concentrating on more than just his revisions, for in 1834, at the age of 46, he married Sarah Boardman. She was a 30-year-old widow who gallantly stayed on in missionary work after her husband had died 3 years earlier. They were well suited to each other. But Sarah's missionary work decreased as her family increased. During the first 10 years of their marriage, she gave birth to 8 children. But the strain proved too much, and in 1845, the year after her last child was born, and while traveling to the United States on medical leave, she died. Judson and 3 of the children had accompanied her on that journey, and he was especially looking forward to having a joyous reunion with family and friends, especially as it had been 33 years since he'd last seen his native land. So this tragedy that had befallen him, needless to say, deeply saddened him. And also on arrival, he found he hardly recognized what had been the familiar countryside of New England, that part of the eastern area of the United States. But not only was he battling again, this time with the grief over a wife who'd passed away, but quite unexpectedly, he discovered in his absence that he'd become a celebrity. And his name had become a household word through his missionary experience. Many considered him to be a living legend, a hero. And although he shunned and was unprepared for and disliked publicity, it resulted in huge crowds attending his meetings. However, if they were expecting to hear exciting adventure stories about exotic people and foreign places, they were disappointed, because all Judson did was to preach the gospel, which many had heard before. During his travels, Judson met Emily Chabuk. She was a young author of popular fiction who wrote under a pseudonym. And while Judson really enjoyed her lively writing style, he was a little bit taken aback that a Christian who clearly had a great gift for writing would waste her time on secular publications. However, when he suggested to her, to Emily, that she write a biography of Sarah, his second wife, she received the suggestion enthusiastically. And as a result of that, their friendship also quickly blossomed. So for the 3rd time, he proposes marriage to Emily in January 1846. And less than a month after their first meeting, they were married. But it has to be said that his decision to marry Emily was a very controversial one. While she was younger, Emily had considered working as a missionary, so there was no real grounds to believe that she couldn't be a faithful wife to Adoniram and a valuable asset to the missionary work in Burma. However, we have to understand, he was considered a veritable saint by Protestant America. So when it came to his life, people's expectations were extremely high. Marrying a secular author, as she was seen, who was still only in her 20s and half his age, was not the proper thing to do according to the American public. But in truth, the barrage of criticism only served really to deepen their relationship. And in June of 1846, they were married. The following year, they sailed for Burma, leaving the 3 children in the care of 2 different families who were never to see their father again. And equally, there were 3 more children who'd been left behind in Burma who would never know the mother who had suckled them in infancy. The whole Judson Saga, like so many other missionary stories, where the picture of crying, frightened children clinging to their parents, never understanding why they were being separated from the only love and security they'd ever known in the world, illustrates the price that missionary families have been caused to pay. And yet, the other side of this story is that despite these traumatic ordeals, 5 of the children born to Sarah and Adoniram grew to play a significant part in the society of their day. 2 of them became ministers of the gospel, 1 became a medical doctor, another became the head mistress of an academy, and the 5th one served honorably in the army until he was disabled in battle. In November of 1846, Judson and his new bride arrived in Burma. Emily survived the voyage well and was ready to somehow try and fill Sarah's shoes to the best of her ability. She became mother to Judson's 2 little ones. Only 2 had survived. And she immediately plunged enthusiastically into language study and missionary work, while never forgetting her talent for writing. Harnessing the power of the pen, she portrayed some of the stark realities of missionary life. She confessed she was bothered by thousands and thousands of bats while taking most of the other creatures in her stride. She wrote, "We are blessed with our full share of cockroaches, beetles, lizards, rats, ants, mosquitoes, and bed bugs. With the last, the woodwork is all alive and the ants trooping over the house in great droves. Perhaps 20 have crossed my paper since I've been writing this. Only 1 cockroach has paid me a visit. But the neglect of these gentlemen has been fully made up by a company of black bugs about the size of the end of your finger." Adoniram and Emily served together for 3 years in Burma, with the birth of a baby girl bringing them both much happiness, even though much of the time was marred by illness. In the spring of 1850, with Emily soon expecting another child, Adoniram, who was himself seriously ill, left on a voyage hoping to recover. However, less than a week later, he died and was buried at sea. 10 days later, Emily delivered a stillborn child, although not until August did she hear of her husband's death. The following January, she, along with Emily and Judson's 2 young sons, sailed for Boston to make a home for the children in the USA. But her own health was broken, and 3 years later, at just the age of 36, she also died. Adoniram Judson left behind 7,000 more children, members of the Burmese Christian church that he and Anne had begun. What enabled Adoniram Judson to faithfully serve for so many years? Well, I think we can see evidence of his motivation in the following lines. He penciled these in on the inner cover of a book he used in his translation of the Bible into Burmese. "In joy or in pain, our course be onward still. We sow On Burma's barren plain, we reap on Zion's hill. Amen. Well, if you'd all like to unmute yourselves, that's the end of yet another incredible life, full of challenges. I've been so blessed. I've also been very privileged in preparing these. And I feel that we have an incredible legacy when we look back and see what people went through and the endurance and the perseverance and the blessing that resulted. And I think this series has changed me, to be honest, as a result of what I've uncovered. Oh, there we are, less than a minute. So God bless you all. Thank you for coming.
God bless you.
Yeah, God bless. Thank
God
you.
bless you.
Thank you, Gareth.
God bless
Thank
you,
you very
Jamie.
much. Thank you, guys.
That's a pleasure.
Bye.
David, Rusty, God bless you. Bye.
Bless you.
You got it. Margaret, Susan, all of you who've attended, Jolie, so many of you. God bless you. And Elsa, lovely to see you. Evangelist Prasad, God bless you.
Yes.
Yes. Chris, I'll talk to you tomorrow, okay?
Yeah, talk tomorrow, yeah.
God bless you all, and I hope you have a great week. I'm sure we'll maybe see you in the church or see you somewhere, I hope.
Hope
Here,
so.
there, or in the air.
Yeah.
Diva.
Yeah, we're in the air.
God bless you. Nelfa.
We're in heaven or in the air when
Bye.
we're done. God
Wow.
bless.
Oh, giving us extra time, maybe. That's good.
Yeah.